So good morning and good afternoon, and colleague, good afternoon, participant online, good afternoon, panelists. My name is Thierry Amusogo. I'm the head of the Division of Knowledge Management and E-Learning of the African Institute of Economic Development and Planning. So on behalf of the Karima Bouneram Ben Sultan, the director of the African Institute for Economic Development and Planning, let me first thank the panel member for their time, because they are busy people these days and they were able to be present here today. And also thank to all the more than 100 participants online for their time and the interest to this webinar. So the webinar is jointly organized by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, the African Union Commission, the African Civil Aviation Commission, the African Airline Association, the International Air Transport Association, the African Development Bank, and the AFRAA Bank, and we expected that they will join us. It is hosted by the African Institute of Economic Development and Planning, what we call IDEP. IDEP is a training arm of ICAO with the main mandate of training government officials on the ground. Let me go straight to the webinar itself. You know, as you all know, it's aimed to address the issue of financing COVID-19 recovery strategies and plan in the aviation industry. And we all know that the current situation in the aviation industry in Africa is challenging, as it is elsewhere in the world. Thus, the International Air Transport Association predict that the African airline will lose $6 billion in revenue this year due to COVID-19. The full year 2020 traffic is expected to plummet by 51%. GDP support by aviation in the region could fall by $28 billion. So what the African aviation sector will look like once lockdown measures are lifted is very much dependent on the form exit strategy take, how they are implemented, and how economies are reactivated. This webinar built on the effort that have been undertaken by industry partners to address the impact of COVID-19 on the aviation industry. It will focus on solution to the liquidity crisis that the airlines are grappling with now. In this regard, we have an eminent speaker from the industry who will make a brief presentation of 5 to 7 minutes, followed by questions from transport experts and airline officials online. We do have a link for the question, and they will ask that question. But let me present you briefly these eminent experts. ECA will be represented by Dr. Robert Lisingi, the Chief of Energy, Infrastructure and Service of the Private Sector Development and Finance Division of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. The division focuses on crowding in private sector investment in African countries, particularly in the area of infrastructure. He holds a BSc degree in civil engineering and a master degree in transportation engineering. He also holds MPhil and a degree of Doctor of Business Administration from Maastricht School of Management in the Netherlands. Prior to this current position, he was the Chief of Operational Quality Section of the Strategic Planning and Operation Quality Division of ECA. Welcome, Robert Lisingi. The African Union is supposed to be represented by Czech Beda. He will join us further, and I hope he will join us later on. The African Civil Aviation Commission, AFCAC, is represented by its Secretary General, Ato Mekonnen Tefera. He was online. You know, prior to joining AFCAC, He had 8 years of experience working as the permanent representative of Ethiopia to the International Civil Aviation Organization, Montreal, Canada. During his tenure as a representative of ICAO, Tefera was actively engaged in the work of the Africa and India Ocean Group at ICAO and is sensitizing states through his effective participation in the development of Draft Common African Aviation Policy, AFRAA, the Abuja Safety Declaration, and the Aviation Security and Facilitation Initiative. I welcome Tefera to this webinar. The African Airline Association is represented by His Excellency Secretary General, His Excellency Abderrahman Bed here. Mr. Bert was a CEO of Air Mali and Air Burkina. He has 30 years experience in airline industry and a total of 16 years as an airline CEO. Mr. Bert built his career in various airline and multicultural environments, both in Europe and Africa, at positions such as aircraft performance and dispatching, engineering, maintenance, and operation quality ground operation, and chief executive officer. I welcome Mr. Abderrahman Bert. The International Air Transport Association is represented by Dr. Adefunke Adeyemi, the Regional Director of Advocacy and Strategy Relations for Africa. Dr. Adefunke was recently honored as one of the 200 globally most influential people of Africa descent in affiliation with the United Nations Decade for People of Africa Descent. She is the lawyer, advocate, executive mentor, and aviation expert with a career spanning over 20 years. In her current role as a regional director, advocacy and strategy relation for Africa at the International Air Transportation Association. I welcome you, Dr. Adefunke. The African Development Bank will be represented by Romain Ekoto. He's trying to join us. He's the Chief Aviation Officer of the AFDB, responsible for developing and executing the bank framework to support the aviation sector in Africa. The bank intent is to sustain practical effort by country, regional organization, and African aviation sector company to overcome their key challenges, particularly in critical situations such as the current COVID-19 crisis, towards a comprehensive transformation and sustainability of the sector. I welcome Romain Ekoto. So that are the eminent people. Eminent, you have quite a very represented eminent for this webinar. And without any further ado, let me give the floor to my colleague of ECA, Dr. Robert Lisinge. Dr. Robert Lisinge, ECA has been at the forefront of a different study to assess the impact and of the COVID-19 and propose recovery strategy. Yes, as a keynote speaker, can you share with us what are the current situation and what will be the next roadmap? You have the floor, Dr. Robert.
Thank you. Can I have the presentation on the screen, please? Thank you. Thank you so much, Thierry. I'm quite pleased that we have managed to organize this webinar today. Yourself and I, we have been discussing for a long time how to organize a webinar, and I have been thinking what would be an appropriate topic. Obviously, I knew that we were going to organize something on air transport, but I've been pondering on different topics. At one stage, I said, well, maybe we should look at the impact of COVID-19 on SATAM. At another stage, I said, well, maybe we should look at the key performance indicators of the Sucro decision that we are working with AUC and AFCAC on. But after we did, we took part ECA in the task force that was created by AUC and AFCAC on the recovery of the aviation industry. I did realize that now that we have a strategy and plan for the recovery, we still had a big gap, and that gap had to do with finance. How are we going to finance the strategies and plans that we have put in place? And so I thought that a good topic for this webinar would be how do we get the airlines out of the liquidity challenges? I'm going to talk about airlines, but I know that the problems that the airlines are facing are the same problems that the aviation ecosystem as a whole is facing, the airport authorities, the air navigation service providers, and so on. So most of the things that I'm going to talk about are going to be applicable to the other elements of the aviation ecosystem. Now, I think the slide is not completely seen, but in any case, I think that the COVID-19, we all know, has had a devastating impact on the aviation industry. Flights have collapsed. I know that IATA and AFRAA are going to talk about that. Airlines have lost revenue, so have all the other players in the aviation industry. Jobs have been lost. The contribution of the industry to the GDP of African countries has reduced tremendously. I am aware that the partners in the industry are not just sitting folding their arms. A lot of efforts have been actually ongoing. I know that the strategies and plans for survival, recovery, and sustainability of the industry have been put in place. I know that the banks have also been active. They have created funds to help the recovery of African economies. But the problem is this: it seems the two streams of action are going on in parallel. While the players in the industries are coming up with strategies and plans, the banks are coming up with different facilities and funds. The two are not speaking together. I think the objective of this webinar is to try to see how we can bridge this gap. We have been pondering on a lot of questions here at ICAO, and I cannot see my screen very well, but I will just mention some of the questions that have preoccupied us here, since the start of this pandemic. The first question is, how will the proposed recovery strategies and plans for Africa aviation sector be funded? That's one question. The second question is, how could African governments and aviation ecosystem access existing COVID-19 funds? What are the financial requirements of the continent's aviation industry? These are very critical questions. What would it take for African governments to allocate resources from stimulus packages to the industry? We know that some African countries are trying to put in place recovery packages, but these have not been channeled sufficiently to the aviation industry. What will it take for that to happen? Who will bail out African airlines? We have been seeing around the world how countries are coming in to support their airlines, but who will bail out African airlines? What are the existing mechanisms that could provide a lifeline for them? So these are some of the questions that have preoccupied the ICAO in the past few weeks and months. Now, what has ICAO done to address this challenge? I think that we have been trying to shape the discussion on COVID-19 in Africa. So what did we do? We have done a comprehensive study on the impact of COVID-19 on Africa's economies, where we look at the impact on trade, the impact on the aviation industry, the impact on logistics, the impact of ports, the impact on poverty in general. We have used all this material to organize 2 web conferences of African ministers finance. This has been very useful because it has provided a platform for ministers of finance to have a coordinated response to the pandemic. And I can tell you that the ministers had 2 communiques in which they highlighted the importance of supporting the airlines or the aviation industry in general. But beyond that, we decided that it was very important to quantify the financial requirements of the aviation industry. And we thought that this could only be done if we look at the different components of the industry. So we started with airlines. And so we work with AFRAA to try to quantify the indebtedness of African airlines. So we look at 37 airlines to which questionnaires were distributed. 16 of those airlines responded to the survey. 15 of them provided information on their indebtedness to banks, financial institutions, to leasing companies, to aircraft manufacturers. And we found out that the total indebtedness of those 15 airlines for 2020 and 2021 was $3.2 billion. We also found out that there were significant differences in the indebtedness of these airlines. I just want to highlight some of the key findings of that survey very quickly. I do need to say that we're preparing a research paper, which we hope that the discussion in this webinar will further enrich that paper, which we will be sharing with everybody very soon. But the key finding of that indebtedness survey was that the bulk of the indebtedness actually is to banks and to leasing companies. So 46% of that 3.2 billion was debt to banks. 38% was debt to leasing companies, and just 16% was directly owed to aircraft manufacturers. We also found out that while banks and leasing companies are the dominant creditors for most of the airlines, for some of the airlines, a few of them, in fact, a large share of their indebtedness was to aircraft manufacturers. Now, the numbers you see on your left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 15, those are airlines. We just coded it because of the sensitivity of the information. But if you look at number 4, for instance, you will see that 100% of the indebtedness is to aircraft manufacturer. This is just to give you a flavor of the mix or the structure of the debt of the different airlines that took part in the survey. What you see on the screen here, I don't know if you see it very well, but this is about, because we also investigated a little bit the employment situation of the airlines, and you could see that the sizes of the airlines varies hugely. From one airlines, number one, having 16,000 plus staff, to another airlines having just about 13 staff. But what we were trying to find out was the measures that the airlines have taken to cope, at least to address the liquidity crisis of resulting from COVID-19. So a lot of them, as you can see, have laid off staff. Where you have Y, it means yes, they have laid off staff. They have cut salaries of staff, or they have sent their staff to paid or unpaid leave. Most of them have done. Just 2 of the 16 airlines that provided information have done none of this. And we found out that those that have neither laid off staff or cut salaries or sent them on leave have some kind of support from their government. Now, I think that, yes. So what are governments basically doing? I'm not sure that all my slides are coming up. Just a second there. Yes, I wanted to talk a little bit about what is the financial requirement, really, of African aviation industry. Of course, the $3.2 billion that came out from our study is not, certainly is just a drop in the bucket, because this is not the full financial requirement. This is just the indebtedness of airlines to creditor. The actual financial requirement would include the debt to creditors, the cost of refunds, which is a big issue. The airlines still have the burden of the refunds that they have to give to their customers for canceled flight, the cost of personnel, services related to maintenance, and so on. So the full requirement of airlines is huge. It's not the 3.2 billion of 16 airlines. That was just to give you a flavor. Now, I think that we also have a sense of the revenue losses due to COVID-19. I'm sure that Funke and SJ Bete probably will talk a little bit about that, airlines are expected to lose up to $6 billion as a result of COVID-19. I even know that figures from ICAO range between 10 and 13 billion of lost revenue. We also know that the industry partners are advocating for $10 billion. Recently, the task force that we were part of, including the AU, AFCAC, and the industry partners, we are actually advocating for $25 billion. So that's a huge amount of money. So what are governments doing in light of this huge financial requirement of airlines? I did mention that government have made an effort, but what we have seen is that this has not been directed to the aviation industry per se. For instance, you can see Benin, Botswana, Burkina Faso, and so on, the amount of money that they have in their COVID-19 recovery packages. This is for the whole economy, but you can see that they cannot even address the requirements of the airlines. So a lot of work has to be done to make sure that the government can not only raise sufficient amount of money and put in this package, but to direct it to the aviation industry. Now, that is what African governments are doing. They have relief packages not directed to airlines, but contrast this with what countries in other parts of the world are doing. We know that in the US, as part of their relief package of 2.2 or so trillion, about more than $60 billion has been given to the aviation industry. In Germany, just a few weeks or months ago, we know that they have, the figure that I have was, almost 9 billion euro to support Lufthansa. So if countries in other parts of the world are supporting their airline industry, there's no reason why countries in Africa should also make an effort to support this industry. I'm just going now to try to summarize what are the measures that governments, one, secondly, financial institution and development partners, two, and thirdly, international organization and sectoral organization, what these three clusters of stakeholders could do to support the aviation industry. And this is more or less a compilation of material and efforts that exist in the literature. So what can governments do? Governments could do two things. One would be in relation to financing, and the second would be in relation to waivers and deferrals. And government would, in terms of finance, provide direct support in the form of grants to the aviation industry. They could provide subsidies in terms of, for instance, subsidizing wages. They could provide loan to the aviation industry. This could be treasury loans. They could provide loan guarantees, and I know that our friends from the bank can speak a lot more on this than myself. By providing loan guarantee, this will enable stakeholders in the aviation industry to get commercial loan at good rates. They could also be involved in equity to have shares in the aviation industry. I actually know of cases where governments have converted treasury loan to equity. And they could defer or waive a series of issues, rents and charges. They could waive taxes, and so on and so forth. So what can financial institutions do? And this is where I think is critical, and this is where ICAO has been trying to link the financial institution and the airlines, because the financial institutions have actually created facilities to support African economies to get out of this liquidity crisis imposed or induced by COVID-19. So, but what can they do concretely? Well, they can provide direct cash advances, they can refinance credit, they can provide guarantees as well, they can issue bond. Development partners, I know, they can provide budget support. There are all kinds of waivers as well that the development finance institutions can be involved in. For instance, they can defer financial obligations or loans. We know about the loan standstill that, for instance, IMF has agreed on for some of the poorest countries in the world, and many African countries are eligible to this. So development finance institutions like AFRAA Bank, they can waive payment of public debt. They can waive public sovereign bonds. And we also have many development finance institutions on the continent that are involved in financing the aviation industry, like the Trade and Development Bank. And I think that there should be a lot more engagement between actors in the industry and this bank. Now, the industry partners like AFCAC, AFRAA, ICAO, and so on, what can we do? And I'm going towards the end of my presentation. I think that we have been busy trying to work to develop strategies, guidelines, and plans. We have been trying to quantify the financial requirements of the industry. We started with the airlines, but I think that, and we did quantify the indebtedness of some of the airlines. What we are looking to work with AFCAC, IATA, and other actors that are interested to look into more detail on quantifying the refunds that the airlines have as a burden right now, because it seems that we are not all quite clear on the actual amount of the burden of the refunds on the airlines. So basically, there's a lot that governments can do, a lot that development finance institutions could do, a lot also that institutions like ICAO could do. And I'm just going to go to my last slide to make some recommendations, which basically is to recap what I have been saying. Now, a lot of options in terms of measures that can be taken to support the aviation industry. But we know that a one-size-fits-all approach will not work. The structure and size of the actors, the airlines, is huge and different. So we need to select the appropriate option to support specific airlines. So an airlines that was already facing, for instance, financial crisis before COVID-19, would the right solution be to provide additional loan to them? That may not be the case. I also think that as a way forward, we need to do more to advocate for government to allocate a substantial amount of the relief package to the aviation industry. The third point, I think, would be to coordinate the action of actors in the aviation ecosystem and actors in the financial world. And lastly, I do believe that we need to accelerate the disbursement of financial support to the airline, because I think that they are in a critical situation. Once again, Mr. Chair, I want to thank you for giving me the floor. I will stop here, and I will thank all the participants. I hear that we are more than 100 for making the time to be part of this important discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Robert for this a very comprehensive, I will say, setting of the scene. He has set the scene focusing on key questions. He tried to address some questions which are still for debate. How we the aviation sector be funded. Another one is how could African government and the aviation ecosystem access existing COVID-19 response fund and benefit from debt relief initiative. The third one is about what are the financial requirements of the continent aviation industry. The fourth is allocate resources from stimulus packages to the industry, and what should these resources be used for? Who will bail out African airline, and what existing mechanisms could provide a lifeline? And he gave us some roadmap. I think, thank you very much, Robert. That is the good setting the scene. And I'm going to give the floor to the next speaker, who is Czech. I don't know, Czech, are you online? Did you succeed to connect? Puy, did you succeed to connect our colleague, the Director for Infrastructure of African Union Commission? Czech is not online. Let's move to the next. Tefera also is not online. I hope my colleague will try to resolve this issue, because Tefera was online this morning. Dr. Apedraham Bert, the Secretary General of African Airline Association. So we are back to you. Can you tell us the COVID-19 related intervention of the African Airline Association, the financial implication of recovery strategy plan in the aviation industry? What are the measures could be taken by government, development finance institution, and industry partner to solve the liquidity crisis of the aviation industry, particularly airline? So, Dr. Bert, you have 5 minutes to 7 minutes, 5 minutes maximum to tell us what is going on.
Thank you, Thierry. Thanks to EDEP to putting together this webinar. I'll try to do it in 5 or 7 minutes, but really it will not be easy. Let's try. So, good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are. And this webinar is very important. The theme being around the liquidity crisis after the COVID-19. As you know, cash is king. My presentation will be around 5 points. And liquidity remains critical for the airlines when now they are preparing for the resumption of their operation. AFRAA made an assessment of the COVID-19 impact on African airlines. Our last assessment issued in July is estimating at $8.6 billion the lack of revenues for African airlines. You know, when we made this assessment in April and then in May, the figures was lower. It's only because we had some assumptions, and going forward, we are seeing that the restart of operations in Africa is delaying. We were thinking in June, African Airlines will restart their operation. Now the international flight obviously will start on August. So there is a high risk of insolvency and bankruptcy among our airlines. It is our hope as African Airlines that this forum will propose implementable solutions, financial solutions for aviation sector. And we, since the beginning of this pandemic, we had some industry initiatives at ICAO level. There was a COVID-19 aviation recovery task force, which came up with a report and a take-off guidelines on 1st of June. They recommended 4 categories of measures: public health, safety, security and facility, economic and financial. On the economic and financial measures, they should be inclusive, targeted, proportionate, transparent, temporary, and consistent with ICAO's policies, while striking an appropriate balance of interest without prejudice to fair competition. Because when you talk about subsidies, for example, it can distort competition. So at the African level, I'll take the occasion to thank also the African Union Commission and the African Civil Aviation Commission, because they set up a high-level task force, and AFRAA participated to this task force also. The task force came up with 16 recommendations. 7 recommendations are related to financing. Here, I'm just reminding 3 important recommendations to highlight what is important to be done. The recommendation number 2 is urging for the establishment of the Stimulus Continental Fund, which is estimated at 25 billion to support the recovery place. Now it's very, very important to see how this fund can be set up. The recommendation number 3 is urging African Union to mobilize African states, IFDB, World Bank, Exim Bank, and other financial institutions to contribute to this fund. This is also very important. And the recommendation number 4 is asking government to give an adequate level of priority to the aviation sector. As my predecessor said, Mr. Dr. Lsinge, many financial institutions are supporting African economies, but we don't know how much of this support will be channeled to airlines industry. So African Union Commission and AFCAC are leading the implementation of this recommendation. So it's also very important because a very big work has been done. It is very important to put in place a follow-up team of this recommendation so that we can effectively see how these recommendations will be effective. So airlines are facing liquidity challenges, and they will continue to face that during the restart period. As you know, African airlines were losing money, loss-making for many years, even before the COVID-19. So the liquidity issue is not new. We are forecasting a slow recovery following the resumptions of business. It means that airline will have excess fleet capacity because of downsized operations. So some are already trying to return airplane to lessors to slash liquidity requirement. Returning an aircraft to a lessor sometimes need also liquidity, some cash, because there are some return conditions, and also the airline may transform excess inventories of spare parts into cash if possible. The airline will be facing also during the restart period some route network management challenges. The first one being an uncoordinated opening of regional markets by states. So if the opening is not coordinated, maybe some states will open and others will still have their air borders closed, which will be an issue for airlines to replan their fleet and their network. And also the demand will be slow at the beginning. If the low travel demand, travel demand is low, it will mean for airlines low load factor. So the profitability of the operations will be also an issue, and consequently some additional liquidity issues will happen. Also, there is an issue about the sales and the bookings received by airlines before the closing of air borders. So the airline will honor these sales and these bookings. It means that they have already received the cash for these bookings, and they have to carry those passengers without receiving any revenue streams from it. So it's important for African airlines to coordinate their operations during the restart period. At AFRAA, we are thinking end of September, early October, to stage a route network coordination among our members to see what is the new business market and how airlines can cooperate better to improve their operation. A third problem will be around payment conditions to service providers and procurements. Maybe at the start, some providers may tighten their payment conditions. For example, if they used to give credit payment, maybe because they have themselves some issues, or maybe because the airline owed them some money, they can tighten their credit condition. It means that airlines will need more cash to restart their operation. So at AFRAA, we have organized on April a webinar, and we came up with 9 pillars recovery plan. The 9 pillars are about government, states, regulators, suppliers and service providers, customers, maintenance and MROs, cost management, cargo operations, workforce, strategies to maintain business continuity. Most of these pillars are also impacting the liquidity position of airlines. So in line with the pillars number 7, which is cargo operation, and number 9, business continuity, AFRAA is currently developing a portal. The objective of the portal is to improve airplane exchange between members and to optimize daily aircraft operations. This is a draft of the menu of the portal, which will give available aircraft list, and airline can also post the request of capacity. So the portal will be launched early in August this year, and we will send out an invitation to participants to the official launching of this portal. So at AFRAA, since the beginning of the pandemic, we made some appeals. The first one was on 18th March 2020 to African government, urging them to assist their airlines. We made another on 6th of May with IATA, ASA, UNWTO, and WTTC. It was an appeal to put in place a fund of $10 billion for travel and tourism sector. And we organized also with UNICA, IATA, Afrexim Bank on 4th June 2020, a webinar between international financing institutions development financing institution, and our member airlines. So on the long term, the sustainability of air transport is very, very important. And we think that there is a strong link between trade and air transport. And as long as all stakeholders, states, AUC, aviation sector, trade sector, and financing institution focus on the African Union Commission flagship project, which are SATAM, African Continental Free Trade Area, free protocol of movement of people, we shall accelerate air traffic growth rate in Africa, and we will grow the air traffic, and we'll have more connections, more trade, and I think this will create a sort of sustainability for our airlines. So lastly, and the high-level task force made also a recommendation, number 14, on sustainability of air transport. For me, this is very, very important because as I indicated, African airlines had been loss-making for many years. So it's very important to have the sustainability. It's very important to put effectively in place the AUC flagship project. It's also important that states ensure the review of aviation-related taxes and user charges to ensure compliance with ICAO policies and guidelines. So to conclude my presentation, I think that a very good job had been done at African Union Commission and at African Civil Aviation Commission level. Again, I would like to thank the Secretary General of AFCAC, Mr. Tefera, the African Union Commission, because for the high-level task force, their team had done a very, very, very good work. Now we need to follow up and to put in place a follow-up team to be sure that the recommendation will be effective and put in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Bert. It is clear the message once again come to consolidate the first message we got from Robert. It is clear Dr. Bert talked about the different ongoing initiatives, the liquidity challenge during the restart period, and what particularly African Airline Association is doing, and the implication for sustainability of the air transport, and mainly the 9 pillars of recovery plan. I think I will encourage a colleague, a participant online, to ask their question by clicking on the questions link. You can ask all kinds of questions you want. Let's move to the real issue to dig and get a clear idea of what can be done. So I welcome Dr. Tefera, a colleague from African Union Commission. Dr. Tefera will help us since the beginning of this, the planning of this webinar. So Tefera, Dr. Tefera Ato Mekon Tefera is the Secretary General of the African Civil Aviation Commission. Prior to joining AFCAC, he had 8 years of experience working
Hello? Hello? Do you hear me? Hello?
Okay. because we were wondering
Hello?
if we should react or just quiet and just let it fly and don't touch it as a topic.
Hello, yes, we hear you, Dr. Tefera.
That's it. Thanks.
Okay. Good morning and good afternoon to all. I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to the organizers for giving AFCAC the opportunity to take part in this webinar. This webinar is very important, as rightly said by the section of AFRAA. I'm pleased also to acknowledge the leadership of the UN ICAO for conducting the various research to come up with a study on the liquidity and to propose the required relief measures to airlines. AFCAC in this webinar is represented by the Director of Air Transport, who is also the Deputy Chief Executing Officer of the Executing Agency of the YD. She is also accompanied by subject matter experts on air transport. Next slide, please. I'm not sure whether my presentation is well displayed. I will be as brief as possible. And my presentation will only focus on what has been done so far on COVID-19 related interventions measures in collaboration with the African Union Commission and the industry group. I will briefly highlight on the establishment of the high-level task force, the African one, and only focus on the recommendations which are related to this webinar, that is the financial aspect on the recovery strategies and plan. Whereas the midterm and long-term plan can be accessed from AFCAC website, because we shouldn't talk about, or we shouldn't focus about on the relief measures, but as we should also address the midterm and long-term strategies and activities which are required for sustainable development of air transport, and also the single African air transport market, which is a pilot project and a major contributor to the recovery areas. Next, please. AFCAC, in coordination with the African Union and the industry group, have developed a recovery action plan for the consideration of the Bureau of the Ministerial Group. The ministers were called upon to intervene in support of the African aviation industry, the airlines, airport, air navigation service providers, maintenance organization, ground handling, catering services. This call was approved by the Bureau of Ministers in their meeting in the early April. And these resolutions have been circulated to all, so that our aviation industry will receive due recognition with their stakeholders at national level, and particularly with policymakers and respective ministries. Next, please. Among the recommendations, next slide, please. Among the recommendations submitted for the ministers in early April was states to address the impacts of fluctuation of rates of local currencies impacting airlines, airports, and air navigation service providers, on the relief of value-added tax refunds on services and other procurements related to spare part and equipment, so that our airlines will have an improved cash flow on their business operations. We have also requested and the Bureau of Ministers also have approved and put a resolution on the need for direct financial support to African Airlines. Loans, loan guarantees, and support for the corporate bond were also called upon to governments to look into such kind of arrangements through their respective central bank. Rebates on payroll tax of employees of industry, jet fuel and associated rebates, and tax breaks were all called upon. These were considered by the Bureau of Ministers. Next slide, please. In parallel to this, the Bureau of Ministers called upon the African Union Commission and the specialized agency of the African Union, that is AFCAC, to look into a coordinated approach to establish a mechanism for the relief and recovery of the industry. Parallel to this, the African Director Generals in their various meetings called upon AFCAC to coordinate and establish a mechanism for a harmonized approach. In this respect, as mentioned by Roberts and Bert, that we coordinated the establishment of the high-level task force in coordination with the various industry groups and the regional offices of ICAO. A high-level task force was established and developed a comprehensive post-COVID recovery strategies that will assist on the relief and the restart of operations. It goes well beyond the relief measures. It took into account on the establishment of roadmap for the midterm and long-term mechanisms. This report of the high-level task force have been circulated to all African member states through the ambassadors at the African Union and also to the ministers responsible to civil aviation and through AFCAC to all Director Generals of Civil Aviation Authorities. What we did after the release of this report, pending the meeting of the Bureau of the Ministers of Transport, we have established an awareness program to the Director Generals. The first webinar was conducted last week, which was attended by more than 185 participants. The main focus was on the regulatory aspects, which should be considered prior to the restart of operations. Next week on Monday, we'll have the second webinar of the DGs, which will only focus on questions and answers to facilitate further sharing of experiences among the Director Generals. Next, please. Dear participants, I will only focus on very few of the recommendations which AFCAC believes is relevant to this meeting. The high-level task force, among its various recommendations, have taken into account as a recommendation that African states and the African Union Commission should ensure access to sufficient financial, human resource, and equipment to support operations through the establishment of a stimulus continental fund to support the recovery plan in the short, medium, and long term for the aviation sector towards fostering the sustainable development of resilient air connectivity and seamless travel on the continent. Government should give an adequate level of priority to the aviation industry in utilizing resources leveraged from COVID-19 response facilities created by development financial institutions and other organizations, including initiatives such as the African Union COVID-19 Response Fund and the debt standstill in 2020 agreed by G20 to support the aviation industry. Next slide, please. African states should strengthen dialogue amongst themselves to implement the fiscal and monetary relief measures to the aviation sector currently under threat from the COVID-19 pandemic. This should focus also on the sustainable development of air transport in the African continent in line with the African Union Agenda 2063. African states and the AU to effectively lobby with governments for the African aviation sector to be given an adequate level of priority in the utilization of resource developed from the different institutions which I mentioned earlier on. Next slide, please. States must contain the COVID-19 pandemic through implementation of the ICAO card and the high-level task force measures to ensure that the industry restarts by implementing these measures. There is also a need for states to implement business continuity plan to ensure the industry's resilience in the face of unfolding economic downturn. States are also to note the African Development Bank efforts to embark on a sector budget support and to actively pursue with their respective government authorities to benefit from these funds. The states are urged to pursue sector reforms through the deregulation of the air transport market, through the single African air transport market, and the unconditional implementation of all the provisions of the YD. Dear participants, unless we assist African Airlines on time, the impact is really serious. We do have airlines facing challenge prior to COVID-19. We have a lot of startup airlines and regional airlines. We couldn't let these airlines to survive by their own. We need to sensitize governments and financial institutions to reach out to African airlines who are in their need to get the support. The other aspect of it is the single African air transport market and the implementation of the provisions of the YD will contribute to the survival of African airlines. If we are late in assisting on African airlines and also in fast-tracking the implementation of the SATM, it will impact intra-Africa connectivity, and the share of African airlines will be substantially reduced, and the market will be left to third-party airlines. I thank you. Mr. Chair, I am done.
Hello, Thierry. Can you hear us, Thierry?
Hello, Mr. Robert. You can continue the moderate.
Yes, I think so. If
connection, yes.
since I cannot, I'm not sure if my colleague in Dakar, Thierry, is connected. I think the next speaker should be our colleague Adefunke of IATA. I don't know if Funke is ready with her presentation. Then I would ask her to go ahead. But I think my colleagues in Dakar will still have to put the presentation on the screen. So Puye, can you hear me? Are you online? Okay. It seems the presentation is on the screen. So Funke, can you take the floor, please?
Thank you very much, Robert, and good day to everyone. This has been a very insightful discussion so far. Hearing from all of our colleagues on the pertinent issues that we're here to discuss has been very insightful and very informative. Just to add to the conversation, we believe that this crisis is totally unprecedented, not just for the world and all the systems of the world, but also for aviation. And aviation is one of the hardest hit industries by the COVID, particularly actually travel and tourism as a whole. And we've heard a lot about that from previous speakers before. So let me take the opportunity to thank UNECA for organizing this, as well as to thank the other participants for our collaboration, particularly African Union, AFCAC, AFRAA, UNECA, and all the other stakeholders since this crisis began. So going into this, regarding the devastation, the level, a comparison of what happened between 9/11 and SARS. And we can see from the slide that the 9/11, as horrific as it was, reduced RPKs by 20%, which is, passenger aviation volumes, by 20% after 9/11 and 12% after the SARS. And this is really nothing compared to what we've seen happen with the closure of borders as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, which saw aviation traffic fall by 95%. Basically, there was no aviation traffic. The only flights that were happening over the 3-month core period were repatriation flights, as well as cargo and emergency flights. Just on that point, I think that the COVID-19, as much as it really restricted movement by aviation and really hampered the industry, it also showcased the value that aviation brings. Without the ability of aviation to have been able to move the essential goods and services across the different regions of the world, and in particular across Africa, supported by many of our airlines, which we really congratulate and commend, it have been very, very difficult to fight the COVID-19 as effectively as we have been able to do across Africa. So this is something to be commended and to be borne in mind, even as we look at how the industry positions itself in restart, that aviation is a critical connector and a critical facilitator for movement of people, goods, and services, and all of the other consequences that come with that. So looking at what this impact is or has been on Africa from economic terms, the impact to GDP in Africa is almost halving, is almost cutting into half the amount of aviation's contribution to Africa's GDP, which before the COVID-19 crisis was $55.8 billion by our last analysis. And right now, had fallen to about $28 billion. So that's over half of the GDP contribution. We also see that half of the jobs that aviation contributed to, about 6.2 billion pre-COVID, are also at risk with 3.1 million jobs. And what is interesting about this statistic is that unlike in other parts of the world where we've seen announcements being made by both governments and airlines about the number of staff that are being having to be either laid off or followed, we haven't really seen as many announcements coming out of Africa. So it's not really as easy to tell what the actual situation is, although we've seen some helpful figures during the presentation from UNECA and AFRAA. But so this just goes to speak to the fact that until it's time for these airlines to actually restart and take to the skies again, it may be difficult for us to know the full extent of the damage. In terms of revenue loss to airlines specifically, we are estimating this at over $6 billion. I know that there's different figures around there, about 8 billion from AFRAA and between 10 and 13 from ICAO. And I guess this is just based on different parameters and assumptions that we make to come up with our figures. But this is conservative, which is typical for us in IATA. The figures are conservative. So we believe that the impact is anywhere between that 6 billion that we've been showing to up to $9 billion. And this is a significant amount, especially when we consider that the profits of aviation in Africa, was 100 million in 2010, which was the last time the industry in our region actually turned a profit. So this is quite a significant issue. Now, this is just to show the picture of what connectivity looked like as at May 2020 compared to May 2019. Of course, we can see that this is a picture that affects the entire part of the world. Typically, when we show this picture, we show how we want Africa to be more connected. But now we've seen that flights really were impacted globally, as we all know. So it really was quite disruptive. Now, as we start to look at the current status quo as well as what happens in the future, we start to consider what is happening regarding bookings for flights, restarting of aviation, as compared to the cases that we're seeing in the countries. And I think, everyone who watches the news, we all know that we're starting to see what could be termed a second wave of spikes in cases in different countries around both the world and in AFRAA as well. And this is an interesting slide. It actually shows the regions that have the number of cases by region compared to how we're starting to see the bookings for travel show up. And this shows that as the cases rise, it's likely to impact the ability of aviation to really pick up. And I think the AFRAA spoke to this as well in terms of the low load factors that we're starting to see, the low demand. So yes, we are moving from 95% at the height of the crisis to the move quite low for what we're going to see. Now, in terms as well of the cash, the cash apart from the loss of revenue, we're also looking at the cash burn of the airline. So while the traffic stopped, it didn't necessarily stop the obligations, the financial obligations that the airlines have. And similar to what has been shown before, this is just a slide that shows some of those unavoidable costs that the airlines have had to continue to make over time. Their variable costs, crew costs, the fixed and semi-fixed costs, the taxes, there's loan obligations, servicing of interest from debts, working capital requirements, their capex, and cash burn, etc. And as at Q2, what we analysis showed that globally the industry had burned over 6 billion in Q2 just on these expenses alone. In addition to that, because there was no flying, there was no revenue coming in for tickets, and airlines in Africa had sold tickets almost worth about $980 million, upwards of $1 billion for travel between the months of March and June 2020. But there was no flying, hardly any between those months. And so, there's the likelihood of refunds for a significant amount of those tickets. And I think we can see here the comparison on the slide of what the ticket sales look like in 2019, ticket sales versus refunds compared to what we're seeing in 2021. This is a huge gap. And this also will form part of the financial obligations that the airlines have. And just to buttress this point a bit more, as we said, airlines generated virtually no revenue. So we can see what happened from January to April, and there was sharp drop once the shutdown happened from middle of March onwards, because the drop, and then the sharp drop between April and June. So in terms of sales, nothing was coming in. Or even, with this sort of perfect storm, if I can describe it like that, the cash reserves of airlines were low anyway. And I think over the years, we've talked about the need for African aviation to be sustainable on so many levels, and some of the policy issues can support that sustainability. So the cash reserves the airlines had were not really able to sustain all of these obligations that they had. And not just in Africa, to be honest, even the most profitable airlines at the time, their maximum holdout period is 4 months, 4 to 5 months before going into solvency. And we already saw examples of several of our airlines in the region who either had to file for business rescue or go into voluntary liquidation, or and similar other economic issues to prevent total insolvency and liquidation. So this is just to show what the cash reserves picture looked like for us in African aviation. Talking about the profits, yes, we talked about no revenue coming in, but profit margins, which were already low and razor thin, totally devastated in all regions. And we'll see what that looks like. The North American region, prior to today, as at 2019, was the forefront, mainly because they have a strong consolidated market and so a few other elements, and they were at the forefront of leading profitability. But we can see what has happened now. But Africa, again, being by far the most hit in terms of profitability profile over this period of crisis. So this 2020 was totally unprecedented. Nobody could have foreseen this. But in 2020 will go into 2021 in a manner of speaking. So we're forecasting that, in terms of profitability, the net loss for this year will come to about, something to $90 billion. But in 2021, it's still going to be a year of recovery, and there will still be some losses recovered, though not as significant. So what I have described so far really is speaking to the fact that aviation industry is in a liquidity crisis and needs all the help that the airlines can get at this stage. What have we done in terms of this particular issue? Recognizing this from about early April onwards, that we would need to support the industry, both in terms of survivability, but also in terms of sustainability and its ability to recover into the future, we started a very aggressive advocacy campaign with states across Africa. We wrote to all African states directors general. We wrote to all African states ministers of aviation, and to targeted states ministries of finance. Letters from our director general, our regional vice president, and different aspects of our organization going to target the respective groups. We also wrote to our partners in industry, so the people who support airlines, i.e. the airports, the ANSPs, other service providers, to support the industry through different kinds of relief. One being direct cash injection into the airline businesses, as well as indirect reliefs, including waivers or reduction or discounts on taxes, charges, levies, and fees that are applied to aviation or to the airlines, and several other waivers and reliefs. I'm happy to report that we have seen some feedback coming through, and I'll talk about that in the other slide, but not nearly enough, not nearly enough. In addition to direct appeal to states, we also wrote a joint appeal, as was highlighted already by the SG of AFRAA, to 12 international donor organizations, as well as regional organizations, including UNECA, who is facilitating this call, jointly by the UN World Trade Organization, the World Travel and Tourism Council, AFRAA, and the Airlines Association of Southern Africa, jointly petitioning or appealing to these international donor organizations to support the travel and tourism industry to the tune of about $10 billion, based on the analysis that we did at that time. So what has been the response so far? Well, some governments around the world, taking our analysis globally, have implemented significant relief measures across the globe. And the different colors here are represented. Let me just highlight them. We see the darker blue representing general economic and stimulus packages. We see the lighter blue, the sharp blue, representing aviation-specific aid. And we see the green and yellow, the green particularly speaking to wages, subsidies, plus aviation-specific aids and economic aids. And then the yellow representing only wage subsidies. I think the picture speaks for itself, and we can see where Africa is right in the center there. We've seen, a few of the places where we have received general aid. I mean, I can mention some of the countries that have announced general stimulus packages: South Africa, Kenya, Rwanda, Nigeria, Ghana. Quite a number of states have announced, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and so on. Many of these states have announced general stimulus packages to fight COVID-19. The issue, though, is how to get the money translating downwards into the aviation industry, not just for the airlines, but the other aviation businesses. That takes us to our next slide here, where, in terms of direct cash to airlines, remember we talked again about the blue, the sharp blue. What we've seen in emerging markets, many of which are in Africa and as well in Latin America, is 1 to 5% margin of government relief, and we haven't really seen direct cash going to the airlines. In just a second, going back to the other slide, aviation specific, we've seen some relief coming from Rwanda. We've seen relief coming from Senegal. We've seen relief coming from Cote d'Ivoire, Botswana, and maybe Burkina Faso. So a few of the states are actually giving directly and are making announcements directly to the aviation industry. We're also expecting from other states, including Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, etc. But again, not nearly enough. So this is an excellent forum for us to speak to this issue of how we can ensure that funding that is allocated or earmarked by both states and donor institutions are coming to the aviation industry. And part of the aid that government has provided over time, is broken down into these areas. This is really where we would like to see a lot of that support. So in addition to direct cash injection to the airlines and aviation businesses, we would, support would be helpful in terms of loans to these aviation businesses and airlines and aviation businesses, the wage subsidies, loan guarantees from governments. And African Union, I don't know if they are on the call now, but they had mentioned on the DG call that was facilitated by AFCAC last Friday that they are working on a mechanism to try to get loans to the aviation businesses will be counter guaranteed by the states where those aviation businesses run. And this is a great, creative way of getting money in. It's one of the mechanisms that could be workable and useful going forward. We've also seen equity financing where, government or, other entities actually take a stake in the businesses. But I think the ones that really speak to us a lot are the issue of the taxes and the charges put on tickets by governments. Now, of course, we recognize that governments, aviation authorities are also in financial distress. But this is the time as a way of stimulating demand for aviation and to stimulate the industry restarting and sustaining itself and recovering, this is a time for many governments to reduce or even waive, taxes and charges. It sounds counterintuitive, but actually this is the time to do so. And everything that we've been talking about, the issue of, putting on a tax or a charge on tickets, it is a disincentive for a significant number of the population to take aviation as a means of transportation. And therefore, it impacts so many of the other catalytic effects of aviation. Of course, corporate taxes, operating subsidies for route funds, cash injection, fuel taxes, etc. So these are all the measures, the kinds of relief that we have seen from different governments across the world, which would all, taken together, are useful for us and also for our airlines, specifically in Africa. Now, having said that, because there is, of course, a need for relief, there are also consequences to those relief. And in some cases, majority of the aid that will come from governments and donors will leave airlines in more debt. So, we're again hoping for direct cash injection. I think that would be the easiest on the industry. But also, in terms of whoever is giving funds, to bear in mind that these are extenuating, extraordinary circumstances in terms of whatever conditions are placed on those funds and relief. So airlines are going to enter restart with very high levels of debt, already coming from a place of decimated revenue, and then combining that with high levels of debt. So the support will be as critical as possible. We have government debt through the different kinds of measures we've talked about: government loans, deferred taxes, loan guarantees, commercial loans, capital market debt, etc. Then we have what comes, of course, from the lending of financial institutions, the banks, the capital market, and the lessors. And so all of these players, our appeal is for everyone to try to come to some kind of reasonable attempt to support the industry to restart, as well as to stimulate demand across the industry. This is a picture that shows the last 7 days of flights in Africa. As some of the flights have started to pick up some more, we're starting to see announcements coming from different countries and different airlines. So again, it's showing that, things are picking up. What we want is to be able to ensure that we ramp up the demand for aviation as quickly as possible, ensuring that states adhere to the CART guidelines that were developed by ICAO and other stakeholders, including IATA, as well as any other supporting industry guidelines around restart. It's also important for us to ensure that we don't fall into a danger of having states going back to territorial approaches and negating the gains that aviation has secured as a seamless system of connectivity and interoperability over the past 75 years. Now, going forward, risk that city connectivity may not really recover is there, but it's important that we do that to ensure that we get that up and even beyond pre-COVID times, especially here in Africa, As the SG of AFRAA mentioned, the SG of AFCAC mentioned, aviation is critical to ensuring that Africa can achieve its promise of self-determination. This is actually a golden opportunity and a critical moment in our history as a continent to come together to ensure that aviation can facilitate the much needed flows of trade, of investment, of tourism that are critical to economic development. And so we should seize this moment and ensure that we continue to promote the flagship projects and initiatives of the African Union and AFCAC, particularly relating to the Single African Air Transport Market, the SATAM, the African continental free trade area, as well as free movement of people and goods and services. One of the things that we're looking to stimulate demand as I end is to ensure that we can encourage people to use aviation, use and stimulate the industry as much as possible. And we also have to think about issues around visas, ease of people coming in, visa facilitation, incentives, destination marketing for many countries in Africa. I have a personal blog on my LinkedIn where I'm promoting some specific African countries, all African countries actually, through a fact sheet. We need to do a lot more of that to encourage intra-African travel, as well as to support continued engagements and connections between Africa and the rest of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Adefunke, for this great and well-researched and insightful presentation. Your message is clear. We are in a liquidity crisis, and what needs to be done is to look for innovative and aggressive solutions, general and targeted advocacy for financial support. I think, I don't know, we are still remaining only 15 minutes for this webinar. I don't know if our colleague from AUC is around, AUC and ADB, check, and Ekoto. If not, let us, we have a number of questions. I'm going to suggest that let's move to the question and response. And participants raise a number of questions. I'm going to share with you those questions. The time maybe when they join us, we can give them a floor for 3 minutes of presentation. So the first question I have here is, how soon can you persuade unwilling government to avail stimulus packages to the airline to save jobs? The first question is from Chitalu Kabalika. He said, how soon can you persuade unwilling government to avail stimulus packages to their airlines to save jobs? So I think let me start with Robert. Robert, you have the floor.
Thank you. Just before I attempt to answer that question, I just want to mention that the Secretary General of AFCAC has indicated that the presentation that he delivered was on behalf of AFCAC and AUC. Of course, AFCAC is a specialized agency of the AUC, so he just wants to put it on record that the presentation that he delivered, of course, the high-level panel and the work that was done by the panel was all under the supervision of AUC. So that's fine. So regarding the question, how soon should government be persuaded? I think cannot be soon enough. It should have happened even yesterday. I think the issue now is all the actors in the industry, including ICAO, we need to engage more with the government for them to realize the importance of airlines and aviation in general to job creation and GDP of their countries. So I think one of the issues why we don't find the aviation industry adequately represented or allocated resources from some of the stimulus packages is that they are mostly driven by the Ministry of Finance and perhaps the ministries of transport under which aviation falls have not been adequately represented in these discussions. For instance, if you take discussions between the government and development finance institutions, it will be the Ministry of Finance which would probably be leading this engagement. So I think that we cannot give up. We now have the ammunition with the necessary data in terms of the jobs that we are losing, in terms of the contribution to GDP that we are losing. So we have the tools that we could use to engage governments more to realize the need, the immediate need of of the airlines. I will leave it here. I've seen some discussions in the chat regarding the sustainability of airlines, whether it's appropriate to be talking about financing airlines.
Yes.
Now, if we have time, maybe I'll come back to that.
Okay, I have the second question. I'm on the question tab first. The second question is from Raphael Kouchi, who say, from all the presentation, it's evident that the aviation industry is in a deep financial crisis. What practical support, especially financial, is available for airline? How will this support be assessed and how soon? Can I request His Excellency Mr. Abdel Rahman, the Secretary General of African Airline Association, to give a very straightforward response to this question? Excellencies, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Thierry. I think during my presentation, I talk a bit about this issue. It's very, very important. The liquidity crisis is real today, and many of the airlines will go, I think, in insolvency or bankruptcy. So during the high-level task force, there were some financial recommendations. I remanded those recommendations, and we are in the hoping that they will be as soon as possible implemented. So the recommendation went to African Union Commission. I understood that they will have meetings with the ministers in charge of aviation and minister in charge of finance also. So I think African Union will lead the implementation of these recommendations. And the sooner it will be effective, will be better for our airline. And I also urge for setting up a follow-up team of the recommendation. During the last meeting of the high-level task force, we talked about it. I think it's time now to put in place this follow-up team so that we can follow up and make sure that the funds required will be in place for the airline. Because you see, from August, many airlines will be willing to restart their operation. We are mid-July, and it's right. We have made recommendations, but so far nothing is concretely in place. There are some fundings to government budget through international financing institution, but we don't know how the government are channeling these funds to support the aviation sector. And also to respond to the previous question, the state should recognize the importance of air transport in their economies in terms of GDP, in terms of job creation. And looking at that, they should really see the importance also to support the aviation sector. Thank you.
If I can just add to that, absolutely agreed with SG AFRAA on that point. Having the strategic importance of aviation underscored to government, especially in this period where all governments are in economic recovery. Aviation is like a leapfrog technology or a leapfrog sector for recovery for any economy. And aviation can do for Africa in particular what mobile telephony did for Africa. That is how important it is, because we can get up and running quicker than the roads and the rail, etc. So it's critical for government to understand that. Now, speaking about the practical ways of financing, I think that it all depends on which entity is lending money. If it's governments, I would suggest, of course, direct cash injection would be great. Other ways of supporting the industry could be for interest loan support, in terms of deferring interest rates, like we saw the Central Bank of Nigeria doing. They reduced the amount of interest that businesses, including airlines, have to pay. So that can help in this period of time. Another is on the the deferral or reduction of taxes and charges, as we're seeing a few of the countries doing, but we need more of that. And also the workaround solution that African Development Bank found, given they don't necessarily fund businesses directly, they fund states. And so the way that they are working around that situation is to guarantee the loans that some of the airline and aviation businesses have taken, which will be backed by loan guarantees. Also, IMF wrote to us following the joint letter that we did with AFRAA and co, and confirmed that they had released $10 billion to 22 African countries. Now, the money, of course, is towards their fighting of COVID-19, but it's to support the government and business sectors. So the critical element here is to ensure that aviation is properly represented at the conversations that are happening at state level. I think bodies like UNECA, African Union, even AFCAC and AFDB can support these kinds of engagements to ensure the advocacy for aviation to be allocated funding when they are allocating funds to different sectors. We know that healthcare is a priority. We know that food and security are priorities, but we also must ensure that aviation is given the priority so that we move away from, this sort of aviation being a luxury, but rather to focus on how it can help to restart the economies of the states. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Another question is about one of your colleagues is saying from early days of the lockdown, industry has expressed concern about the liquidity impact on the aviation industry. Almost 4 months later, we are at the same point. What will be the triggers for effective implementation of required measure before it is too late? I don't know if Mekonnen is online. Acho Mekonnen? If not, I'm coming back to Robert. Robert, you have the floor. Acho Mekonnen, okay. You have the floor. Let me repeat the question. The question is about from early days of the lockdown, industry has expressed concerns about the liquidity impact on the aviation industry. Almost 4 months later, we are at the same point. What will be the triggers for effective implementation of required measures before it is too late? It's a question from Shamsu.
Terry, are you expecting me to answer, or SJ McKinnon is there?
You can answer.
Okay.
Because the time is way to the end of the time. Go ahead, we can answer.
Well, I think that we know what can be done. We know what can be done by government. We know what can be done by development finance institutions. We had it in our presentations. There are basically 3 or 4 things that could be done. It could be grant. Governments or financial institutions provide direct support as grant. It could be loan. It could be, if it's a government providing the loan, it could be treasury loan. Or it could be, if it's from development finance institution, it could be corporate loan or sovereign loan. It could be guarantees. So why is this not happening? Well, I mean, one reason could be that the airlines may not be sufficiently aware of the facilities that are available in the banks. That is why ECA has organized a series of webinars to try to link the airlines on the one hand and the development finance institution. And I'm pleased to say that based on the feedback that we are getting from AFRAA Bank after the last meeting that we have, it seems some airlines have already been contacting the AFRAA Bank. So it's a case of matching what is available in the financial markets and the requirements of African African airlines. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just managing the time now. The last, we say the last question is about need for African airline to restart the civil aviation industry are so considerable that we need a strategy. Why not to implement a strategy based on the Pareto law, including the Africa interest only? Madam Adeyemi, can you tell us exactly what our friend is looking for here? He said the need for African airline to restart the civil aviation industry are so considerable that we need a strategy. Why not to implement a strategy based on the Pareto law, including the Africa interest only?
Okay, sorry. The strategy should be based on what? I didn't hear the last part.
Pareto law.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I see that we have some economists in the house, which is great. Okay. So what I want to say about that is this, that as I mentioned in my closing during the presentation, this is an opportunity, a golden opportunity for African airlines and African aviation to come together. The moment now is where we can look at consolidation, we can look at cooperation. This is the moment to do these things. We've been talking about it for some time, but it had proven difficult because we were already established in certain ways of doing business and certain ways of doing things. Now, together we will stand stronger. And I think this is a moment in time for us to do this. I know that we've been talking about this for some time, and we're in constant engagement with AFRAA, with ASA, and all of the other critical stakeholders to see how we can really drive this forward meaningfully. I'm certain the SG of AFRAA is working on something along these lines, but it is a moment in time to see how we can ensure better efficiencies in the business models. I think somebody also mentioned on the chat that alliances can be formed, and I know that SG of AFRAA was interested and had in alliances, and actually this is one of the outcomes that came out of the African Aviation Industry Group session on the back of the last AFRAA AGA, that should look at how we can form some strong corporations across the African continents, across the airline businesses. But it's not just because of the business model, it's also because of viability of the airlines. And this is a critical element for anybody who is going to fund or provide financing. So it's a chicken and egg situation. If you're strong financially, you get more money. That's why the Dangotes of the world, you have all of the funders in the world, all the lending organizations, they're lining up. But when you're weaker, it's a bit more tricky. And the reason is because the lenders want to know that you will be a good investment and there will be a good return on their investment. So it's something that we must always bear in mind, that business sustainability is critical, not just for the sustainability of those businesses themselves, but for their ability to secure funding. So I hope that is that question.
I hope so. Thank you so much. From the chat,
may I add?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Bert.
Thierry, I can?
Yes, you can go. You can.
Yes, I want just to add on what Funke has said, and I fully agree with her. You see, for example, in Africa, we have 5 hubs and we have 5 global airlines, but this is not enough also to have a very good connectivity within Africa. So I agree the fund needed to support airlines is very important, but also the need for air transport is also very important. We don't have to think just because of COVID-19, we need to downsize, because the growth rate of air travel in Africa was predicted to 4.4% per year during the next 20 years. Maybe it will be delayed because of COVID-19. We'll come back to the level of 2019 in 2 years from now. So it's true, that we have too many small airlines, but the small airlines also are necessary to have a very good connectivity within Africa. In long term, we need to think about some models of airlines, working profitable models. Airlines need to restructure themselves and also even to go to consolidations. For me, for this COVID-19 financial liquidity crisis, I don't think we can start making differences between small or large airlines or private or state-owned airlines. So the most important thing for me is when you put money somewhere, you make a due diligence to be sure that it's viable and you can have a repayment of the amount you are putting in the business. So in long term, yes, we need to definitely have a strategy, a reflection on the business models within Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Bert. The last question from the chat. Ngoe is saying, while we are considering overcoming the liquidity crisis, how can this be linked to full liberalization of the intra-African air transport market? Is a protection not more costly due to inefficiencies? Robert.
Yeah, I think that all I can say is he is making a valid point. There are different issues, inefficiency, but the topic of this webinar is about getting the airlines out of the liquidity crisis. This is an immediate problem. And so we and the task force that AU and AFCAC actually set was looking at the solutions in 3 dimensions. The immediate, medium, and long term. The immediate problem is now, how do you have the airlines to survive? The medium term is when you start looking about sustainability of their business. But I think what the point that Dr. Ndo is making, and I saw other comments related to sustainability and so on. These are longer term issues. Once these airlines have survived, and this is the whole objective of this meeting, how do we inject cash into the airlines industry so that they don't collapse? Once that is done, then we can look at the longer term issues related to and so on. So that is the way. I think those are very pertinent issues, but I think we are now in the survival mode to make sure that the airlines, first of all, exist before we start talking about the other issues, which are very pertinent. And I can say that there are a lot of efforts, and this is in terms of build back better. How do we build back a better aviation industry after COVID-19? So issues such as alliances, consolidating the airlines together, full implementation of the SATAM and YD. You have the African Development Bank and Afrexim Bank trying to set up a leasing platform which will help the African airlines to expand. So these are longer term sustainability issues which are very important to take into consideration as we try to build a stronger aviation industry.
Thank you so much. We are losing.
May I add on that, Cherry?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Something very important for me also is the African civil aviation policy. We have currently a policy, it's an old one. We need to review this African civil aviation policy so that to adapt to the new situation we have in Africa, and also to work on a better sustainability of airlines business within Africa. I know that the AFCAC, the African Civil Aviation Commission, has already announced that they will start working on the review of the African Civil Aviation Policy. This is very, very important for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we are at the end of this webinar because we lose many of participants since we are beyond the time which was scheduled, but that's not a problem. Now, let me give you 1 second for each of you, if you have a key message to share with the remaining participants. And so we close this the webinar. So let me start with Dr. Adeyemi. You have the floor. Just 1 minute.
Thank you very much. The key message here is that the airlines and the aviation businesses need financial support. They need it as soon as possible. They need it now for the survival and their ability to be sustainable into the future. It's also the opportunity for us as Africa to really take hold of these policy initiatives of the AU, of the SATAM, of the AFRAA, and the Free Movement Protocol to start working even as the aviation industry restarts again, so that we restart in a new way and really can transform the industry. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Abedahram, Bert, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. My last word will be to say that cash is of essence. I was very happy to participate to this webinar. I really hope that the fund needed to restart the African aviation sector will be put in place as soon as possible. This is very important. And for me, any crisis is also an opportunity. So we need to think about the opportunities ahead, and also rethink the African airlines business. This is very, very important because we need more sustainability of the aviation sector in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I give the floor to Robert to close this webinar, I just want to inform participants that we are going to share with them all the presentation, even the audio record. We have a record, the full audio, and there will be a poll at the end, a poll question and answer that my colleague Puy will manage with you. So Robert, you have the floor for your last word. Hello, Robert? Hello? Robert, you are muted. It seems that Robert is having an issue, and I don't know if Robert, listen. Hello? Anyway, let me ask my colleague Puy. You can start the poll with colleague, for those who are still online. You check the floor and you can continue and guide them.
Hello, dear participant. You can just click on the button answer to answer the survey, please. Thank you very much.
So, Robert, are you back? Because we are trying to get you, but for your last word. Okay, let me thank you all the panelists.
Back now, can you hear me?
Okay, yes, you have the floor, please. Let's go with your final word, your final key message.
Well, I think that we are now at a stage where we're talking about the survival of the airlines and in fact the aviation industry in general. So all the actors, the partners in the industry and institutions like ourselves, AU, African Union, AFCA, we have to do everything possible to make sure that the airlines do not collapse, because we know the contribution that they are making to job creation on the continent, as well as its contribution to the GDP of our continent. But while we are ensuring that the airlines survive, we need to take this opportunity to rethink the African aviation industry, to make sure that we have a sustainable industry that will contribute to the African continental free trade area. So let me just take this opportunity to thank all the colleagues who have attended this webinar. The presentation that I did earlier draws from the work that we did with AFRAA on the indebtedness of African airlines, but ICAO being a think tank, we are available to partner with other actors in the industry to do such studies. I think we started to reflect with AFCAC and AFRAA on the issue of refunds. How is this a burden on the airlines? So we will contribute everything that we could to strengthen African airlines. So this has been a pleasure, and we hope that we will continue organizing such events going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. Let me use the opportunity to thank all the presenters for the great and very insightful, I will say, full and well-researched presentation. We have enough on the plate to enrich the publication, ongoing publication. And also thank you for your intervention, your responses to the various issues raised, which are very pertinent. And I think we captured all of them, and we are going to share with you the outcome of this this webinar, which will come through also, Robert, through the ongoing publication at the ICAO level. So thank you so much, Dr. Adefunke. Thank you, Dr. Abderrahman Bet. I thank Dr. Chefera Mekonen. He left, I think, one of the participants said that beyond all what we are saying, internet connection is another challenge. I think that one is true. It's still there, but we try to manage the existing situation. What's available? We optimize what's available to get what we want to get. So I thank you so much. I don't think you need to wait for the poll, and we are going to share with you the poll with you, and we continue to interact with the participants. There were more than 100 at the beginning. Now they are 75, but that is it. It's okay. Thank you so much, and I wish you all the best. Stay safe, and I hope this is just the beginning of a journey, and we'll have the next one soon, in less than 2 months. I hope so. Thank you.